The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield, and joined here as always by John Cuna. Today we're going to be discussing mental health and culture. So I think one of the reasons why we started this podcast was to get into, to use sports as a lens to look at mental health through. And I think sports is definitely one form of culture, but I think when you talk about culture in general, that's a pretty broad term, right? I think, so maybe I'll talk about what culture means, and then I'm going to kick it to you, to John, to talk about, why it's important. I think culture in general, I sort of think of it like culture, quote unquote, versus a culture or a subculture, things like that. I think culture as a general word, again, very broad, it sort of reflects, collective behavior, trends, tendencies, beliefs, things like that of an entire group of people. All of us. I guess you could go as high as to say global, or probably such a thing as global culture in a way. And then there's a ton of subcultures that go from a large scale down to maybe the smallest possible scale. So I think, we have different career tracks in terms of what led us to become therapists. Mm-hmm. I know you think LMHCs are
superior is the word
superior.
You're looking for.
Yes, that is. Sorry.
Yeah,
it didn't quite roll off the tongue. I am partial maybe to the social work track, being a clinical social worker. So in social work, John, I don't know about you, but we talk about systems, right?
Yeah,
systems that are at play, and all the different systems and subsystems that we're a part of. And it could be family. It could be a lot of different things. I mean, you can go as much as talking about geographic, culture, subcultures, or political, or ethnic, or racial, or religious. Age and generation is definitely one. Gender, sexual orientation. Cultures could be centered around a thing. I mean, sports is an example of that. Video games. There's probably like a crypto subculture going on right now,
sure,
or Web3 or whatever. There's a lot of different things going on. And so, I think all those subcultures shape the bigger culture, right? And it's like this huge system that's always changing and always adapting and moving in different directions, and sometimes rapidly. Most of the things that change culturally are very slow, I would guess. I think mental health is probably an example of that, where it's taken quite a long. In the scheme of things, last 5 years, 6 years, things have really changed quite a bit. Yeah, even the last 2 years, things have changed quite a bit. Before that, though, fair to say, for decades, the pace of change when it comes to mental health awareness, stigma reduction, things like that, very, very slow. So that's what culture is. When it comes to the overlap between, the concept of culture and its various scales and mental health, why would you say that's important? Why does it matter?
In terms of why it matters to be talking about mental health and its
and
intersection
culture.
with culture.
Yeah, the overlap of those two things.
I think for a few reasons, right? If we sort of boil this down and have it focused on sports, culture, and mental health, I think it's a really great way to broaden the conversation and bring more people in. Like you had mentioned, the last 30, 40 years, mental health in terms of a part of our culture, collective culture, hasn't really been a conversation, right? It's been reserved for the people who have been dubbed sick or crazy or whatever. Mm-hmm. And as you sort of incorporate mental health into either these subcategories of different cultures, you start to, like you had mentioned, you start to broaden the overall umbrella culture as a whole. And so when we're talking specifically around sports culture in the last, like you said, probably since 2018-ish, right around there, we've seen this just bubble eruption of mental health in sports, and the culture around mental health in sports has completely shifted, right? Just recently, I think Coach K from Duke is now starting his what's it called? Teammates and mental health organization, where he's starting an entirely new initiative. The NFL, I think 7 of the NFL teams have full incorporated people on staff now. More people on the way. Still far behind in we have our own thoughts about like just shoving a person down there to check a box versus actually getting in there and doing work. But in terms of shifting culture, like you said, it does take a lot of time. And so it's nice to see when there's more integration in all these different places of different culture, like you said, whether it's sports, whether it's schools, whether it's racial or whatever it happens to be. When you start to see more presence of it, the culture as a whole starts to shift. I think it's an interesting piece because, like you had mentioned, global culture, and I think there's certainly some cultural trends that sort of, go outside of the United States. But I would say that mental health as a conversation, I'd say the United States, and this, I might be woefully wrong in this one, and I'm obviously biased because I live here, but I think that there are lots of places around the world that are behind in the conversation around mental health, specifically with sports. The UK is a good example of that they're just like behind. And trying to like catch up now, I think, which is good. But I think that it's a really good conversation because when we're trying to, one of our main missions is to just put out information, destigmatize mental health, increase awareness. And if we can find these intersectionalities of different cultures to bring the conversation into, it just feeds into the greater whole.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the UK because, I mean, as you were talking, I'm thinking about like what are the cultures outside the US that are maybe behind and why? I think it's different. Depending on where you look. I mean, there are some, I think in some ways, this is going to sound, I don't want to say it's going to sound bad, but it's going to sound provocative, I guess. I mean, I think mental health to a degree, I wouldn't call it a luxury, but it's a thing that's reflective of a lot of other things being taken care of. Like, for instance, the ability to find food and the ability to have shelter and not living in poverty. I mean, there's a lot of poverty in the United States as well. But I think comparatively to other countries, it's, the United States has a pretty good, that's painting with a huge broad brush. But I think there's a lot of countries that are behind in mental health because they're dealing with war or they're dealing with, poverty, famine, things like that. That's different, right? I think you have to have, I always think about, I think it's overused and probably needs to be readapted in a different way, but we always talk about like the hierarchy of needs and where that fits. Yeah, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you look at that pyramid, there's a foundation of things like shelter and food and things that matter. And self-actualization, I think, is at the top. And mental health is probably woven through all the different areas of it.
Right. But without the foundation of those other things, it's difficult to get to.
Right. And if you look at the way, psychological functioning works or mental health works, it I wouldn't call it a backup, but it serves to the physical necessities and the physical safety of a human being always comes first, including the brain's ability to like use denial and just shutting down through something really traumatic to protect the person, right? Yeah. Now, that gets them through that day. Does it cause long-term issues? Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about long-term issues when it comes to some of the athletes that we've tried to shine a light on because they open up about their mental health. That all usually has to do with trauma and the prolonged impact of trauma. When a person's going through something traumatic psychologically, their mental health long term is not what takes precedence. It's the fight or flight kind of how do I protect myself kind of mode. So it's interesting because I think there's a lot of countries that are behind for those types of reasons. Then the UK doesn't have that excuse, right? So it's kind of that's where I think different aspects of culture kind of weave in. I think the general culture within the UK, and there's a lot of subcultures within that, whether it's by country or that kind of thing. Just doesn't, I wouldn't say they believe in it as much, or maybe they're starting to, but I mean, we've had a lot of people who have moved here from the UK that reach out to have us work with them or work with their kids. And this is anecdotal and not based on evidence because it's a small sample size. But the thing I hear the most, I think you've heard it too, is like, we come from England or we come from this part of the UK and they just we don't talk about this stuff. We don't believe in it. So I think from a country perspective, there's the belief or the buy-in isn't quite there, hasn't quite shifted yet. I think from a family dynamic perspective, in terms of you talk about culture within families, the MO is to not air your dirty laundry, not talk about things that are your personal business. And that might not be as much about anti-mental health as much as it is about, hey, it's not good form to open up the stuff that's going on under your roof or in your family to anyone else because that's only your business. Yep. That, I think, is a very entrenched cultural thing in the UK that probably is going to take some time to change. And I think this is why we find sports so interesting because the UK is, when we were trying to plan this episode, we were looking at like which cultures are kind of behind. The UK is the first one that stood out. Yeah. I know you've talked a lot about, you're a huge soccer fan. We're not going to get into the whole Messi versus Ronaldo thing. Okay, we know where you stand.
Go Revs though. Yep. Playoff game tonight.
That's true. Yeah. They came out of nowhere. might have to get some tickets to one of those games one of these days.
Yeah.
So we know you're a huge soccer fan in the UK and, Europe and a lot of other places outside the US. Soccer is massive. It's becoming even more big here. But it's interesting because I feel like sports, I would guess sports is the vehicle through which that change is going to happen in the UK. Because I'm actually surprised that their teams haven't already been the first kind of step in that wave happening. But I think it's needed. I think it needs to happen yesterday. You talked a lot, John, about the fact that prehab and doing those types of things, it's not a luxury. It's a must-have these days. And I'm kind of surprised that I haven't done a huge deep dive into UK teams and whether they have these services or not, but from what I've read, they're behind American teams in this kind of sense. And it's a shame because I think if that happens quickly, and we encourage it to happen quickly, it's going to feed into the culture there and the younger people and the younger generations.
Right. Yeah, I think they're still behind in sort of the ideology of how to integrate mental health services. I think, for the teams that do potentially have someone, they're sort of guilty, kind of the same as the way that the US is of like, great, fine, we'll hire a clinician to be full-time staff, or we'll hire somebody to work like 8 hours a week, which is like ridiculous. It's a good baby step in the right direction, but it's still under the ideology that it's like a wait and see, or like we'll wait around until something goes wrong and then we'll try to do some work with that. And I just don't see that that's an effective way to treat people. And I mean, you wouldn't wait to train somebody physically until they got hurt and then incorporate best practices for training. You wouldn't wait for them to get injured until you did that. So why are we doing the same modality for our mental health? And the prehab concept is one that I think I'm hoping is going to be just become the norm. It's just training. It's another aspect of what you need to be able to do for training. And I don't see that stuff happening really anywhere. I think there are pockets of athletes who talk about it, and it's a little infuriating because the athletes that talk about it are like Tom Brady and LeBron James and Michael Phelps and Naomi Osaka and Serena. Like, you talk about the Mount Rushmore of athletes, right, who are talking about the importance of doing this ahead of time.
It's infuriating because it's like,
why isn't this just common practice? So, the best athletes in the world are doing this stuff preventatively to make them better athletes. And while I'm not going to put all the credit on the fact that they're probably doing this training as the reason why they are better than everybody, but it certainly contributes to their ability to be a higher level performer. And it baffles me why this isn't something that's just best practice right now. Just like we should have somebody who comes in, works with the entire team, gives them all of the skills and the exercises that they need to be able to do, and then be able to do either ongoing care for people who need additional services or periodic check-ins, or like treat it just like you would training. So I don't think that that's a part of the culture quite yet. I think that that's a hopefully in mental health, the culture of mental health. I think that's something that we've talked a lot about, that of trying to shift the dynamic of like, let's just wait around until something, that's typically how things happen. Like, okay, everything's okay.
It's reactive.
It's reactive. Proactive. Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. And I think that sports is an amazing vehicle to try to shift that, to shift that idea. And if we start just sort of incorporating this work into it, it won't be so threatening for people to be able to come to. So, that's one of the bigger conversations that I think I want to continue to have. The UK, I've had a few conversations with some coaches over in the UK, and they talk a little bit about it, but it's like this clawing at like trying to dig themselves out to get to the players, and it's not really that effective. And they don't really, the feedback I get is like, I think we're helping, right? And even for the coaches or the people that are doing the performance work over there, they're not working at the top level teams. They're working at like Champions League or Champions Series or like the lower leagues. So they're not even working with the best teams. Now, I do know there are certain individuals in professional soccer in Europe that are working with people, but again, it's more of a reactive piece than it is of like, this is just who I go to for my mental health training.
Well, and it's interesting because you talk about reactive versus proactive, and I think that's definitely one thing that serves as a barrier, is that people, by and large, tend to still be a little bit reactive when it comes to mental health. If sometimes that's because they're just, in denial about the role of mental health. Other times it's because of we talked about Marcellus Wiley in one of the previous episodes, and his comment about, hey, your ankle's hurt. You look at the ankle. What caused it? Let's treat it. That kind of thing.
Right.
And we talked about how it doesn't translate to mental health, and the reason why it doesn't is because mental health is not it's not as simple as one cause that you can view and one effect that you see right in real time. It's usually something that happens gradually over time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's multiple causes, and then the effect can be nuanced, and it's like difficult to understand. I think for that reason, reactive is not a great strategy, because by the time you react, you're probably too late. And this is where mental health is very different than physical health, is that you have to intervene much, much earlier, because the things that start to kind of join forces from a mental health perspective in an underlying way and gain steam in a very negative direction that can come out, think about like burnout or depression or other things.
Right.
Stuff can come to the surface when you least expect it, but it's been forming for a long time. And so I think that's where prehab or being proactive makes such a difference, because you're not likely, the biggest example of this is substance use. No one sees the line of addiction. No one decides to use a substance because they're like, well, I'm just going to get addicted.
Can't wait to get addicted.
Yeah.
Right.
The line of people is out the door of those who said, it's not going to affect me. I'll never get to that point. I'm different. Yeah.
I can handle it.
That's what everyone says. And then their brain crosses this imaginary line or invisible line that they can't see, which makes them go into the territory of addiction. Now it's a whole different ballgame. And you're flirting with that danger every time you really don't do things from a prehab perspective, and you don't take care of your mental health. So it's interesting. So I think proactive versus reactive is one. I think the other thing that comes to mind, this is relates to your Mount Rushmore comment, is that I think a lot of people, particularly young guys, there's a spectrum, I think, when it comes to mental health in terms of, I would say, self-confidence. I think when it comes to self-awareness and self-confidence, self-awareness, I think, is more important. Self-acceptance and self-awareness. You don't always have to be confident. But where you lie on the spectrum of self-awareness, in terms of being extremely self-aware versus being not very self-aware and in denial, I think has a correlation between your willingness to get help. And so as you see people like, the highest performing athletes, look, they deal with fans, they deal with most of them have like gotten to a point. Brady's a great example of like his self-worth is not on trial here.
Right.
He's trying to see how far he can push himself to get the most out of his one life.
Right.
It's a challenge. It's a puzzle to him. That's not about like his own self-worth. His self-worth is kind of like he had a great family and he's lucky in a lot of ways, right? It's very secure. I think a lot of people who aren't in that position struggle to open up and get the help they need early on, because when they're not as self-aware, or their denial is high, or their self-confidence is low, they're more likely to sort of delude themselves into thinking that they should have already had this figured out, and they shouldn't have any mental health issues or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that delays a lot of people.
I agree, and I think that's, as we bring it back to, I think that's part of our culture, especially male culture, right? Like when things are wrong, we're supposed to have this just innate ability to figure it out, right? Without any guidance or any instruction or any help or any support, we're just magically supposed to be able to figure this stuff out, which is ludicrous when you just like break it down to like logical thinking. That's completely irrational. How are we supposed to do something when we've never been explicitly taught how to do something? And again, that's why I think that sports is a great way to do that, because I think it just brings the barrier down for them to increase their self-awareness and use other people as models of like, oh, they reached out and sought help, and this is how they did that, and they hear more stories of people that did that they can relate to, and it can sort of just continuously break down the barriers for specifically males, but not just males, everybody to get help.
Definitely, and I think you bring up a good point about males. Males being, males, particularly in the U.S., or I guess in a lot of different cultures, as a subculture, is definitely an area where, compared to non-males, are less likely to be open emotionally, less likely to be proactive, get help, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's where we see multiple cultures or subcultures kind of combining in a way that's not to the benefit of people and their overall mental health. It's interesting that the UK, we talked about the UK being an example of a culture that's kind of behind and how that overlaps with the sports world. It's ironic kind of in a way that the Ted Lasso show is kind of based, in the UK with I think Premier League, a fictitious Premier League team.
Yep.
Because it touches on, I'm not going to ruin no spoiler alert needed. I'm not going to ruin the show, but it touches on two key things that I think we promote quite a bit. And by season, the first season is all about this coach with a different style who really cares about his players and is willing to use that care to sort of get the best out of the team. It also has a bit of a underlying kind of cautious word of caution or theme of caution about unchecked optimism actually having some negative effects, which I think was really subtle and kind of cool.
Yeah.
The second season brings in a sports psych. They say, I don't even know if they call her a sports psychologist, but she's really a therapist or just a psychologist. Mm-hmm. And it's great because she works with athletes on the team, but really along the lines of what we talk about the real person, the whole person, not just the athlete as a tool.
Yep.
And it's just really cool. So I think it's interesting because within that culture that we talk about being behind, they had the show as being the setting in the UK. So we're going to talk about that show probably in some other episode once you finally get around to watching it.
I'm all caught up.
Are you really?
I did. I binged pretty hard over Thanksgiving break, and I'm finally all caught up.
Okay.
So yeah,
we're definitely going to have
incredible show. And one of the things too that I really noticed that's definitely more apparent in season 1, but definitely in season 2 is one of the things that, you know, we'll probably spend time talking about a whole episode on. And one of the things that I really noticed was accountability being like highlighted, which I think is something that we could have an entire conversation about. But like when someone made a mistake, they were accountable for it and took steps to rectify that rather than trying to find these like, you know, ant holes to try to get around it or find different ways to get there. And I thought that was something that was, I don't know if it was done on purpose to like emphasize that, but I just felt like at every conflict, the resolution was done well. Like almost like how I would try to help people come together. It felt real, which was really, comforting to see, of like people taking accountability for mistakes that they've made, apologizing, and then finding plans to be able to move past that and forward. I thought that was a really good theme that I noticed. Not as much in season 2. Again, I won't spoil it. Lots of stuff happens in season 2, but definitely in season 1, that was one of the biggest ones. And to your point too, I really enjoyed I think we get fed a lot of like, be optimistic, be positive. And if you're only that, it's not great. And I thought they did to your point, I thought they did a really good job of subtly bringing that in. And definitely in season 2, you see a lot more of the downfall of that.
Yep.
And I thought that was a really good piece that they were able to incorporate into that.
Absolutely. I'm so excited that you
dude, it's so good.
you hit it from me, man. I didn't know.
Surprise!
We're gonna have to plan. We're definitely have to plan a couple episodes where we, maybe do episode recap or sort of the more psychological aspects. We pull out kind of the themes. So you know who Roy Kent is now.
Oh yes,
right?
I sure do.
Do you see some similarities?
Yeah,
just a little bit.
A little bit.
My sister says she thinks of him. So it's probably just because I swear a lot.
Yeah, probably.
Life, but I try to keep it PC on the podcast, but definitely pro profanity, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
So. One thing I want to touch on here at the end, John, is just like we know how important sports have been. We know how important sports and pro athletes are going to continue to be when it comes to the topic of mental health and really impacting the cultural shifts because they have such a massive platform and they overlap with a lot of subcultures and they have a reach. They reach a lot of people and people look at a lot of pro athletes as role models for better or worse. I think lately it's been for better because a lot of them are taking this stuff so seriously and have been a great voice. So we know that's going to be important moving forward. What are the changes, in your opinion, still needed in the sports world when it comes to the overlap of mental health?
Oh, wow. From like a team perspective?
Team or, I guess from a team perspective or just how those two topics overlap in the media or that kind of thing.
I think, we've sort of touched on it a little bit, in this episode. I think that the ideology of mental health and the practice of mental health in sports needs to shift pretty dramatically. Needs a lot of reform in that area. To my point, I think everything is just very heavily on the rehab side, right? Like we just sort of wait for something to go wrong and then we try to repair. So that's one that we need to shift that, and we need to be preparing athletes before things happen because I've talked about this beforehand. But if you go through a massive injury, you're going to be out for 6 months, you're going to be out for a season. That's probably going to put you in the lowest point of your life, potentially, or at least one of them, and then asked to sort of like rehab the actual injury and then feel good and be motivated and be, working consistently. That's a hard thing to do. Yeah. If you've been taught the skills previously, you're much better able to access them in times of need versus like, oh, now everything's going wrong. I think I've mentioned this before, but the analogy that I always use is like if you're getting chased in the woods by a bear and you come across a bicycle, you don't want to have to learn how to ride a bike right then. You want to be able to hop on and get away. Yeah. It's kind of the same concept of that. So I think that's definitely something that needs to really shift. I think there needs to be more presence of it. I think there needs to be more than just one person, filling a checkbox for these teams. And I'm not behind closed doors with these teams. I don't know what the conversations look like.
Yep.
I think I'm a little bit more cynical on that side of like, they're like, well, okay, media is telling us and giving us flack for not having somebody, so we should probably just put someone there so we can
Yeah.
get them off our back. That's probably more of a cynical side. I hope the conversations are, we want to be supportive. I think Rabel actually was talking a little bit about it a couple weeks ago about mental health being a main focus for him in his locker room and for his players on the Titans. Didn't work. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Even with good mental health, there's no guarantee.
No guarantee you're going to win.
Yeah.
Just kidding. But I think so. I think that type of stuff needs to be more apparent. I think it can go down to coaches level where it's not just like a singular person. It really does need to be a complete overhaul, like a holistic approach to integrating this stuff. And we're going to talk about mental health and education in our next episode. And it's going to be sort of similar themes around that. But it can't just be this one-off, like, okay, great. Yep, we've got a mental health professional. Like, let's just forget about it because we've got someone covered to do that. If you're talking about one person for a football team, that could be upwards of like 200 people, right? And now you're reaching like school counselor levels of people trying to support. And again, we'll talk about this in our next episode, but nightmares that you hear from school counselors trying to support 200 people. That's like, it's impossible to meet the person where they need to be and give that level of support. So I think more professionals in the field would be important. I think more emphasis on proactive and prehab mentalities around just this becoming a part of training. And then I'd love to continue to hear more stories from people to come out. I think as it pertains to culture, I think that when somebody talks about their experience with mental health or talks about mental health, the subcultures that they reside in, it draws attention to those cultures and makes it sort of like you sort of give permission for the people that are within that subculture to be able to talk about it. And there's definitely certain cultures within the United States, but also elsewhere where mental health isn't talked about, or it's vilified even, or it's like we don't talk about that stuff, or whatever it happens to be. And if you see somebody from within your subculture openly talking about it, it might give a little bit more credence and permission for you to do the same. And that's, I think, how the slow matriculation of mental health that tends to happen. But the more voices we hear, the more presence we see, it will just become just a natural part of the conversation versus like we have to talk about mental health in sports. It will just be mental health in sports.
Yeah, no, you bring up some good points. You talk about like sort of services on the team and then also the need for more people to speak out. I think services on the team, we've talked a lot about this, and I don't know what the answer is because we keep going back and forth. I mean, to me, it seems like I'm gradually moving more towards like, in my opinion, sports teams, pro teams are massive businesses, and I think they're always going to care about their bottom line. I don't know that I would trust a team to really back up what they say about wanting to have a mental health specialist on staff without full transparency. That worries me. To me, I think the same way doctors, right? They have a surgeon on staff or a team doctor. It's like all the stories that have come out about that doctor being told and knowing that they have to do what's in the best interest of the team, not the person. Mm-hmm. Huge problem with that. I think the same thing would extend to mental health.
Great.
Logistically, if not only just because of trust and the diminished trust for the players. So in my opinion, I think where teams can make the most difference is providing like what we would call psycho-ed, which is just education around psychological topics, mental health topics consistently. Providing a forum for players to talk to each other about these things and have the education around mental health. I think that's where they can make the most difference. Whereas like the individual work, I really feel like they shouldn't have someone on staff. They should just have a pipeline to the best professionals in the community that they can feed to. That way the player can really trust that this stuff is confidential, because otherwise they're never going to open up about this stuff. And even if they do, I don't trust teams to not try to abuse that. I wish that wasn't the case, but that's kind of my opinion. The second part about speaking out, I have some thoughts on this because I totally agree with you on the need for more people to speak out. A couple things I've noticed that I think are problematic is that I don't know if this has to do with mental health becoming an untapped market of business that a lot of people are looking at, which freaks me out because I think, look, at the end of the day, we live in a capitalist society, so that's going to happen. I worry when it comes to like exploitation and other things. It could just go in a lot of different bad directions. But so I don't know if this relates to that, but I see a lot of people over legislating how people talk about their mental health. Like they're wrong for saying it X, they should have said Y, or like the culture you see a lot on social media about like, oh, it isn't this, it's this. This is like the classic TED Talk title, right? Where it's like, why are we saying this when we should be saying this? It's all about like whataboutism. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I don't think that's to the benefit of mental health. I think if people are going to speak up about their mental health and use whatever freaking terminology they want, excuse my language, they should be able to. And I think it's to our all collective benefit, because the more people that speak out, that first of all, they get helped. Other people see them speaking out, which helps a lot of people collectively, and it moves the conversation forward. That slow cultural shift moves as quick as it can, I think. Whereas if we start legislating how people are, what's the right or wrong way to talk about mental health, or for instance, you've heard a lot about like people feeling like we shouldn't only talk about mental illness, and it's like there's a fine line between saying that and really coming down on the people who have mental illness and are willing to talk about it. We want everyone to talk across the spectrum about mental health, whether it's mental illness or just general stress, but we can't criticize the people who are coming out and talking about a diagnosable mental health issue, because that is important too.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
I agree. I think this speaks to, we've talked a little bit in previous episodes, but this, like, I think we're quicker to cancel than we are to listen, right? So like this cancel culture has just like completely gone off the rails in my opinion. I think in certain aspects it's been really valuable to challenge thought, but now it's just run rampant, and people don't have the freedom to say anything or even make a mistake when they're saying something, because we're quicker to be like, to your point, like, no, it's not that, it's this.
Yeah.
Versus like, well, let me just actually listen to what the person is saying and trying to say, and they might just not know how to say it, and then maybe you can have a conversation or a dialogue about it, but shoving somebody back down who's trying to raise their hand to tell their story or to ask for help is not the effective way to move the conversation along. So I think you're sort of seeing this conflict of different cultures sort of coming together, where I agree. I think we've talked about this in other episodes too. Like, we have a really bad tendency to go from one end of the spectrum to the other. So like we went from like not talking about mental health really at all, and now we're moving more towards like always talking about mental health. And I think that usually, to your point, comes with exploitation and people trying to make a buck out of it. And I think we are trying to not necessarily slow the progress of the conversation, but keep it like within the guidelines, and keep it sort of where people can feel comfortable coming to it. They're not going to be ridiculed for making a mistake if they say something, but really trying to be, I think the conversation should always be listen first, then make comments or reflections on that. But I think it's reversed. People are so quick to, they probably don't even have an opinion on what is being said. They're just quick to be like, that's wrong, you're terrible, and then that's it.
Well, this is where everyone having their own opinion and having a voice or a platform to immediately and impulsively reveal it, I think, is what causes a lot of these issues, because it can lead to a context where, and I think you just talked about how do we kind of guide this conversation or shape it or frame it. I think is really key, because the people who are opening up about mental health need to have what's considered psychological safety, right?
Agreed.
They have to have the ability to talk about this stuff and not be ridiculed for it just because of how they said it or when they said it or whatever, that kind of thing. And I think the instant opinion expression is a huge problem. I think it's gotten better on Twitter, just from someone who's been on Twitter at different points for hop on and off for the last few years. I think it's less negative now. It seems like, the people who are making comments are more likely to validate and less likely to just ridicule. So I think it's starting to shift. But still, the unchecked opinions, man, is like, I think people love that about social media, but it's also just like, does it come with headaches, right?
Yeah. Agreed.
So we're going to wrap up for today. Want to appreciate, or just thank everybody, for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast, for this discussion about mental health and culture. We'll be back next week to talk about mental health and education.